everyone, it's Matt, and today I will be showing you my Nintendo GameCube game collection. And much like the Nintendo 64 game collection video I did a few months ago, I will simply be showing you each and every GameCube game that I own, and telling you my brief thoughts on them. So, I do hope you enjoy it. Here we go. So, the first GameCube game I have here is called 4x4 Evo 2. And I don't recall much about this game other than it was a truck racing game or an SUV racing game of sorts. I think it was gifted to me. And if I recall correctly, it wasn't necessarily the greatest game. I think it got kind of bad reviews and was a little janky at times, but I do recall having at least a little bit of fun with it, even if it wasn't anything mind-blowing or particularly memorable. That said, I'm not sure I'd recommend it to anyone looking for an old GameCube game to play, but I do have fond memories of it nonetheless. Next up, we have an imported GameCube game from Japan. And this one is Atsumare Made in Wario. And for those of you not too familiar with Made in Wario or WarioWare, Made in Wario is the Japanese title for the WarioWare series of games. And back when the GameCube was more of a thing, and the Game Boy Advance as well, I was a huge fan of the WarioWare games, particularly the original, but when I heard a GameCube version was coming out, I had to have it. And this was back in the days of Nintendo releasing games in Japan many months prior to America. So I, being very impatient and recognizing that the WarioWare series is simple enough that I could probably get away with not knowing Japanese, I imported it. And despite all that, I actually don't remember a ton about this game. I much preferred the Game Boy and DS games to this, I think, but I do remember thinking this game was fun, even if I can't remember a ton of the specifics about it. And so I think the GameCube version, or the American version, might have been called WarioWare Incorporated Mega Micro Games, but I may be wrong. Either way, I'm glad I imported it because it was fun to have early. And it is kind of neat to have Japanese GameCube games. They come in a slightly different, or actually very different type of case, instead of something the size of a DVD case like the American versions. Japanese GameCube games come in this smaller case to match the smaller disc. Slides out here like that. Anyway, that is Atsumare Made in Wario. And next we have Battalion Wars, a game I don't remember a ton about. But being that this game, I think, came out sometime around the era of the original Advance Wars, I would not be surprised if it was at least somewhat related. I don't think it was by the same people who did Advance Wars necessarily, but it has wars in the title, and I don't know, the aesthetic of the game kind of reminds me of Advance Wars, which I remember a bit better than this game. But from what I do remember, this was kind of a cross between real-time strategy and a third-person shooter of sorts. So you would both shoot the enemies in real time and command troops, although I may be misremembering. I do remember said, I don't remember a whole lot about it, so I don't think it was quite as memorable as some other GameCube games. But yeah, that is Battalion Wars. And next up, we have a very unique game that worked with a very unique controller. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Now, if I remember correctly, the bongo controller that you can see here on the package actually came with a game called Donkey Konga, which we will get to next. But this was a very different game. Donkey Konga was a sort of rhythm music game, but this was an action platformer that you played by slapping the bongos. And I remember it being pretty short and simple, but very fun. I remember having a lot of fun with this game, even if it didn't last very long. There's something especially visceral, I suppose, about having to smack objects instead of push buttons to control a game. Kind of reminds me, in a way, of why I like the recent Nintendo Switch game, Ring Fit Adventure, so much. A game where you have to exercise to do attacks. Very different game, of course, but I was reminded of it. But on the topic of the bongos, the other game I have that worked with them, and actually came with them, I believe, was Donkey Konga. This was back in an era with lots of rhythm games like Dance Dance Revolution and Guitar Hero. But this one was very unique, that instead of pushing buttons or dancing, you, again, slapped bongos, which is very fun, and that's really all I have to say about it. I remember thinking it was a great rhythm game, but I don't have much else to say beyond that. Donkey Konga, good game for a underused controller of sorts. And next up we have a trio of racing games. The first is Extreme G3. And if you guys remember my Nintendo 64 video, you may remember Extreme G being in that, and this is, of course, the third Extreme G game. Better graphics than those, for sure, but kind of the same as the other two, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, really, but it means that the novelty had kind of worn off by then. So, while I did enjoy Extreme G3, I think it wore off a bit quicker than the first two for me, unfortunately. That said, I do kind of miss the futuristic racing genre, though there are a few games out there. It's not quite as popular as it used to be. There was something very cool and exciting and unique about them, and this game was one of many that captured that attitude. But yeah, Extreme G3. That's that. The next in this trio of racing games is Freak Style. Very different from a futuristic racing game. It is a motorbike or dirt bike racing game. And I feel like the vibe of this game has probably not aged very well. It was back when extreme sports and nu metal and things like that were all very popular. And despite that, despite it not necessarily aging well from a vibe or graphics or anything standpoint, I remember having a lot of fun with this game. It's pretty simple overall, but I don't know, I can't really describe why I had so much fun with this game, but there's something just simple and fun about driving a motorbike around and doing tricks off jumps and racing with nitro boost and all that. That said, it is not quite as good as the next and third game in this racing game trio. And that is IfZero GX, which is, I believe, my favorite racing game of all time. It is a game that many thought of as inaccessible, and I don't blame them, because it is indeed very difficult at times. And in my mind, this is kind of like the Dark Souls of racing games. It is incredibly difficult with a big learning curve and requires a lot of patience and focus, but if you can get good at it, it is incredibly satisfying to play well. And I just don't think I've ever played a racing game that gave me quite as much excitement and adrenaline as this one, though I haven't played as many racing games in recent years. Either way, if you want a good classic racing game that is challenging and fast-paced and unique, IfZero GX is absolutely what I'd recommend. And I am very sad that Nintendo has yet to come up with another IfZero game since then. I would pay good money for a new IfZero game for sure. And next up, we have a game that I believe was actually free. Well, not free, but a pre-order bonus for another game, which we'll get to next. But this one is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, the GameCube edition, with the Master Quest version included, which is a harder, more challenging, rearranged version of it. So I don't think there's really that much that needs to be said about this. If you're familiar with video games, you're probably familiar with The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. This is essentially the same as the Nintendo 64 version, which I actually never owned, if you recall, but I do own this, so same thing basically. Anyway, that was a pre-order bonus for The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, which, in my mind, is one of the best Zelda games, despite the controversial amount of backtracking and sailing across wide, open oceans and so on. Some people found it a little boring, but I thought it added to the sense of adventure. And despite all the initial complaints about the cartoony, cel-shaded art style, I think it is one of my favorite Zelda games in terms of graphics because of how unique and charming and expressive everything is. And so if you like Zelda games and you haven't played The Wind Waker, I would highly recommend playing it in some form, whether it be the GameCube version or the HD version on the Wii U or however else you want to try playing it. Highly, highly recommended in my mind. And next up is the very first GameCube game I ever owned, and that is Luigis Mansion. I know some of you are thinking, that reminds me of your last video, Matt. Mario. That's right, this game was the inspiration for my last video. And Luigi's Mansion, because it was my first GameCube game, holds a special place in my heart. But not only because of that, because it was a game that I got before I realized I needed a memory card to save the game. And so my brother and I would play through this game without saving. We would just leave the GameCube on overnight so we didn't have to turn it off and lose our save data. And as soon as we finished it, we just started over again. And I really, really enjoyed it. It's a simple, fairly short, but very charming game. A great mixture of not so scary horror elements and exploration and humor. I wish Nintendo made more games like this. They've only ever made 3 Luigi's Mansion games in 18 years now, so I would appreciate more, not necessarily Luigi's Mansion games, but charming, playful, unique spin-off Mario games like that. Of course, there are a ton of spin-off Mario games, but you know what I mean. Something very unique, like Luigi's Mansion. And speaking of spin-off Mario games, we have Mario Superstar Baseball next. And I don't necessarily think this is one of the best Mario sports games. That would probably be one of the Mario Tennis or Mario Golf games in my mind. But I did enjoy this game quite a bit, at least for a little while. I remember thinking something about it felt a little broken, like the CPU would cheat often or something like that. I may be misremembering, but despite all that, it's a good game. Would I rush out to buy it again? Maybe not, but still, it was a good time, especially with friends. And next is one of my favorite games of all time, Metroid Prime. And if you haven't played Metroid Prime, and you have a GameCube or a Wii or any other console that plays some version of it, and it sounds the least bit interesting to you, I would highly recommend it. Very few games, in my mind, have come as close to nailing the balance this game strikes between exploration and shooting and atmosphere. It's basically the perfect length. It's not too short, not too long. It has the perfect balance of puzzles and action and exploration, and I don't know, there's not a ton I can say in detail about this game, but I absolutely loved it, and just holding it right now makes me want to play it again, so maybe I will sometime soon. But yeah, Metroid Prime. If you like exploring another planet and finding aliens and shooting things and getting upgrades and all that, you will probably like Metroid Prime. Excellent game. And I cannot wait for Metroid Prime 4, whenever that comes out for the Switch. And as you might expect, next up we have Metroid Prime 2 Echoes in this very shiny, reflective, rainbowy case. And Metroid Prime 2 Echoes I thought was great. It's not quite as good as the original in my opinion, but the original would be very hard to live up to. Essentially, it's more of the same, but with a twist, being that I think the entire game, or much of it, has an alternate universe known as the Dark World. Or, I don't know if that's the exact name for it, but it was a Dark World of some sort. And I remember this game being particularly challenging compared to the first one, especially some of the bosses. They were very difficult, but it made it all the more satisfying to finish. But yeah, not much else I can say about it. It's just more Metroid Prime, and I really liked it. And next we have Namco Museum, which is, as you might expect from the box art, just a collection of old Namco arcade games. And if I remember correctly, my family actually bought this because my parents wanted to play some games from their childhood, like Galaga. And there's not really too much to say about this. It's just a collection of old classic arcade games. They're fun, but you can play them on pretty much any console that's ever been released if you really want to. So that's that, Namco Museum. Next up we have another Japanese import game that I was too lazy to wait for the US release of, and that is this Naruto game. I don't remember the full title in Japanese, and I forgot how to read some of my Japanese, so I'm not going to attempt it. I did take Japanese classes in school, but it has been quite a while, so I'm pretty rusty. But either way, I the English version of this game was called Naruto Clash of Ninja 2. And this was pretty much just a Naruto fighting game. That's really all you need to know about it. If you liked Naruto, you know what Naruto is. And if you like fighting games, you know what those are. There wasn't anything too special about it in my memory. But I had some fun with it. And back when I was really into Naruto, I was very excited to be able to import this. So, that's that. And next up we have a very unique game, and that is Pikmin. I think that's a good trigger word. Pikmin. And Pikmin, if you're not familiar with it, is a sort of real-time strategy game where you control an army of up to 100 little creatures called Pikmin to do tasks and defeat enemies and collect objects, with the ultimate goal of rebuilding your spaceship and flying off a planet before it's too late. And I never did finish this game, unfortunately. I think I got close, but I kind of got burnt out on it, especially because it is quite challenging at times. There is a time limit, and if you don't do everything perfectly within the certain number of days you have, basically you have to start the whole thing over. They did, I think, alleviate that in future Pikmin games, but that said, even if I didn't finish it, I did have a lot of fun with it, and I would recommend it for anyone who is interested and hasn't played it. Though there are more recent Pikmin games like Pikmin 2 and 3 that may be a bit more accessible, because like I said, there are a few limitations on this one that made it extra challenging for me in my memory. And speaking of Pikmin 2, I did have it at one point, but I think I sold it. There are quite a few games that I ended up selling or only renting back in the day, though I don't really sell games these days. I wish I didn't back then, because it would be cool to have a bigger collection. Anyway, next up we have one of my favorite survival horror games ever, Resident Evil 4. I always love the cheesy Resident Evil voice line that they play on the title screens of these games. Though 4 and 7 are actually the only ones I played all the way through. Wait, that's not true. I recently played Resident Evil 2, the remake, on Xbox, but anyway, Resident Evil 4 I think was the perfect blend of third-person shooter and horror. I think today the controls might feel a little clunky in that you can't really shoot and walk at the same time, but regardless, I remember it being very intense and exciting and at times very scary. If I remember correctly, there was an enemy called the Regenerator or the Iron Maiden. I think there were two versions. And those things scared me when I was a teenager, for sure. They were quite spoopy. But anyway, Resident Evil 4. It is on most, well, not most, but many consoles these days, so if you haven't played it yet and you want to, I would highly recommend it, for sure. And next up, we have another game that I think was gifted to me, and that is Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, the video game based on the movie, based on the book series. And if I recall correctly, this was pretty much your standard movie tie-in video game. Basically not great, pretty simple, not very impressive in the graphics department or anything like that, but serviceable. And I recall enjoying it nonetheless, at least for a short time. And that's all I really have to say about it. A series of unfortunate events for the Nintendo GameCube. And next we have Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut. And I remember really wanting a Dreamcast, like really wanting a Dreamcast when it was a thing, though I never did get one, and this game was one of the reasons why. I remember thinking it was super cool to have a high quality looking 3D Sonic game, and though in reality it wasn't necessarily a great game, at the time it was exciting that it even existed in my mind as a Sonic fan. And though this game is not quite as good as its sequel, I do think it was pretty good. I'm not even sure I finished it, but it was pretty good. In my life, I've had issues with finishing games sometimes, even when I like them, so that's not necessarily a knock on it, but it's 3D Sonic. You basically know what you're getting with 3D Sonic, so that's that. And speaking of 3D Sonic, we have a sequel next, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, which is an enhanced port of the Dreamcast version, much like Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut. And this game, when it came out, when it was a thing, I played the hell out of this game. It is super cheesy. Don't get me wrong, it is cheesy. It's not even necessarily that great. It's, I don't know, something about it. When I was that age, it hit the spot for sure. And it was interesting because I had a lot of different styles of gameplay, from the standard Sonic running around stuff to levels where you walk around in a robot suit, and a whole mini-game slash, I guess, animal raising mode. I think they were called the Chows. I don't know. I love this game. I can't say I love it now. I think I tried to play it recently and it felt meh. But at the time, I loved this game, so I have very fond memories of Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. And again, speaking of 3D Sonic, we have Sonic Heroes, which was basically more of the same like the last two I showed you, but not quite as good in my opinion. That's really all that needs to be said about it. It's a decent 3D Sonic game, but not the best. That's it. And next we have Soul Calibur 2. And I've never been a huge fan of fighting games, really, most of them. But when this game was coming out, I noticed that Link was in it, a realistic looking 3D Link. And that was enough to get me to pre-order it. And I'm glad I did, because it is genuinely a very good fighting game. It's a lot of fun for people who don't want to necessarily dedicate hours to learning all the combos. But if I understand correctly, it does have that depth if you do want to do that. It's kind of the best of both worlds. And though I never really got great at it or anything, it was a lot of fun with friends, and I did enjoy the adventure mode, or the story mode, whatever it was called. So yeah, a good classic fighting game of that era, Soul Calibur 2. And now we have Star Fox Assault. I did have Star Fox Adventure, or Adventures at one time. I forgot what it was called. But I think I sold it. I remember thinking it was really weird and not a good Star Fox game, but fun nonetheless if you didn't compare it to the other Star Fox games. And anyway, back to Star Fox Assault. This was basically a sequel to Star Fox 64, and I don't think it was quite as good as that game, unfortunately, but it was very difficult to live up to Star Fox 64, in my opinion, one of my favorite games ever. That said, it was kind of the same thing for the most part, even if it wasn't quite as fantastic. It did have better graphics and sound, which I thought was cool. But if you have a choice between this and Star Fox 64, the choice is easy. Star Fox 64. Glad I got it though. Next up is Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike. And I don't remember a ton about this really, except that I thought the graphics were incredible. And for its time, the graphics are pretty darn good. If I remember correctly, I think I did actually want Rogue Squadron 2 really badly before this came out, but eventually this came out and I didn't have Rogue Squadron 2, so I got this instead. And that's really all there is to it. A good Star Wars game for its time, though I'm not entirely sure if it's any good by today's standards. I haven't played it in forever. Maybe I will later. And here we have Super Mario Sunshine, a game that had a lot to live up to. The previous 3D Mario game was Super Mario 64, and a lot of people were hoping this would top it. And a lot of people think it didn't top it, or even match Super Mario 64, but that's okay, because I still thought it was a great game, if not quite as great as Super Mario 64. It has a very unique gimmick in the fact that you have a backpack that shoots water all over the place, and a lot of the game's mechanics and levels were based around using that water. It was kind of an interesting example of an early physics system in a game, or at least it felt like physics to me. I'm not entirely sure if it classifies though. Either way, a good, very unique Mario platformer that I thought was maybe not quite as spectacular as Mario 64, but still a great time. And I'm glad I got it, for sure. And next is another game with the word super in its title, and that is Super Monkey Ball. And I thought Super Monkey Ball was awesome. A very simple game, really. You have a monkey and a ball, and you roll that monkey and the ball around a course. And there are other little mini games, but they don't really matter because all you want to do is roll the monkey around the course in the ball. And despite that being all you do, I thought it was very fun, very challenging, and had a very arcade game-like feel to it. And I don't know, just a great game. Everything from simple levels to super challenging ones and everything in between. And I have no real complaints about it. Super Monkey Ball was great. I think Super Monkey Ball 2 was great as well, but I don't have it. I can't recall if I only rented it or if I ended up selling it, but great games, those Super Monkey Ball games. And now the third and final game I have with Super in the title. Super Smash Brothers Melee. And chances are you have heard of this game. It is the second Super Smash Brothers game, and arguably the most popular, especially in the competitive scene. Basically, you play as a bunch of different Nintendo characters and beat each other up, and that's all there is to it. A true classic, and very, very fun, even to this day. And there are 2 more games left in my Nintendo GameCube game collection. The first of which is a little game called Beautiful Joe. And this is definitely one of my favorite Nintendo GameCube games. There are very few games like it out there, and it is basically a cel-shaded comic book style side-scrolling action platformer where you go through levels and beat up a ton of enemies and do some platforming. And it had the twist of being like a movie in that you can slow it down and speed things up and zoom in and out and everything, and it would alter how your character plays, like going in slow motion would increase the power of your attacks, I think, and you could speed up to run across gaps maps and things like that. I may be misremembering some of this because it's been a long time since I played it, but I remember loving this game so much. Absolutely one of my favorite GameCube games, and I would not complain one bit if they came out with a modern Beautiful Joe game. That said, my wishes were fulfilled for a sequel to this game because the last game in my Nintendo GameCube game collection is, as you might have guessed, Beautiful Joe 2. And Beautiful Joe 2 is basically more of the same with another playable character, Sylvia here. And not that that's a bad thing, but being that it was mostly more of the same and even kind of reused some bosses and characters, it didn't quite have the novelty of the first one, so in my mind it's not quite as good or memorable. That said, I enjoyed it almost as much, and it was even more challenging than the first, which was quite difficult and satisfying at times. So, I'm glad it exists. And I hope they make a Beautiful Joe 3 one day. I know they had some spin-off games like a fighting game, and I think there was a DS game, but those weren't quite the same, unfortunately. I want another real Beautiful Joe game one day, though I'm not getting my hopes up. But anyway, that is about it. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I do hope you enjoyed seeing all of my Nintendo GameCube games. I'll see you next time. Have a good night.